The North African desert, in the summer of 1942, harbored a new and unsettling menace. Across hundreds of miles of open, shifting sand, small, agile columns of radically altered American utility vehicles raced, bypassing established German and Italian strongpoints to materialize unexpectedly, delivering devastating blows to enemy airfields. The men inside these machines would, before long, claim to have crippled more Axis aircraft than the Royal Air Force achieved through traditional air combat in the same period, a feat that almost never materialized. This unit, born in July 1941 from the insistence of a young officer then convalescing on crutches, represented an extraordinary gamble for the British military. Fewer than 70 men proposed to accomplish what entire brigades had failed to secure. Their operations across North Africa, from a disastrous initial mission in November 1941 to their founder's capture in January 1943, would account for an estimated 250 to 400 enemy aircraft. While these figures were perpetually debated against Axis records, the fact remained that this small force compelled Field Marshal Rommel's command to divert irreplaceable frontline troops to guard vulnerable rear area airfields. This organization, actively resisted by many within the British military establishment, eventually provided the foundational template for every modern special forces unit in the Western world. The narrative of its unlikely success is inextricably linked to a particular machine, not one of British manufacture, but an American design. The Willis Jeep, conceived in Toledo, Ohio, as a simple general-purpose vehicle, will be transformed by sheer necessity and British ingenuity into the desert's most feared raider of the Second World War. To grasp this improbable evolution, one must first understand the individuals who forged it and the desperate circumstances that made their very existence possible. The North African desert, in the summer of 1942, harbored a new and unsettling menace. Across hundreds of miles of open, shifting sand, small, agile columns of radically altered American utility vehicles raced, bypassing established German and Italian strongpoints to materialize unexpectedly, delivering devastating blows to enemy airfields. The men inside these machines would, before long, claim to have crippled more Axis aircraft than the Royal Air Force achieved through traditional air combat in the same period, a feat that almost never materialized. This unit, born in July 1941 from the insistence of a young officer then convalescing on crutches, represented an extraordinary gamble for the British military. Fewer than 70 men proposed to accomplish what entire brigades had failed to secure. Their operations across North Africa, from a disastrous initial mission in November 1941 to their founder's capture in January 1943, would account for an estimated 250 to 400 enemy aircraft. While these figures were perpetually debated against Axis records, the fact remained that this small force compelled Field Marshal Rommel's command to divert irreplaceable frontline troops to guard vulnerable rear area airfields. This organization, actively resisted by many within the British military establishment, eventually provided the foundational template for every modern special forces unit in the Western world. The narrative of its unlikely success is inextricably linked to a particular machine, not one of British manufacture, but an American design. The Willis Jeep, conceived in Toledo, Ohio, as a simple general-purpose vehicle, will be transformed by sheer necessity and British ingenuity into the desert's most feared raider of the Second World War. To grasp this improbable evolution, one must first understand the individuals who forged it and the desperate circumstances that made their very existence possible. By the middle of 1941, Britain's hold in North Africa was rapidly eroding. The German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had landed in Libya with his Afrika Korps that February and immediately began driving British forces back toward Egypt's defensive lines. The vital garrison at Tobruk found itself encircled. Overhead, the Royal Air Force struggled to maintain any semblance of air superiority against the German and Italian air forces operating from Libyan bases, which in turn launched continuous attacks against Allied shipping and troop concentrations. A shift in approach was clearly necessary and it would take an unconventional mind to envision what that might entail. The man who would become central to this shift was, by any conventional military standard, a distinctly problematic officer. Born in London in November 1915 to a prominent Scottish aristocratic family, this individual had, despite his background, often seemed destined for a different path. Having been educated at Ampleforth College, he was later expelled from Cambridge University after a year marked by excessive drinking and gambling. Standing at an imposing 6 feet 5 inches, he possessed the robust physique of a mountaineer, a profession he had pursued before the war intervened, interrupting his ambitious plans to conquer Everest. He had initially joined the Scots Guards Supplementary Reserve in 1937 and served with a commando unit known as No. 8 Guard Commando. Yet, his military record was far from exemplary. He had nearly faced charges for malingering, and his superior officers regarded him with a blend of frustration and grudging amusement. When his commando unit was disbanded in August 1941, following heavy losses during the evacuation of Crete, he was laid up in a Cairo hospital. A spinal injury, incurred during a poorly executed experimental parachute jump, had rendered him unable to walk for weeks, leaving him confined to a bed with little to do but contemplate. It was during this period of enforced inactivity that his radical tactical concept took definitive shape. He had observed firsthand the inherent limitations of traditional commando operations. These typically involve large formations, often 200 men or more, transported by sea or air to their objectives, then deployed in massed assaults. Such operations were inherently complex, demanded immense logistical coordination, and were easily detected. The enemy had quickly learned to anticipate them, leading to countless cancellations when surprise was lost, and when they did proceed, casualties were frequently severe. He envisioned a fundamentally different approach. His conviction was that small, agile teams, no more than 4 or 5 men, could, by operating with stealth and swift mobility across the immense, largely unguarded desert flanks, achieve far greater destruction of enemy aircraft and supplies than an entire conventional commando unit. The desert itself, he realized, was the key. Unlike the European theaters, with their continuous front lines, the North African campaign was characterized by vast, unpatrolled gaps. The sheer scale of the desert made complete garrisoning impossible. Small, specialized teams could exploit these gaps, traversing hundreds of miles undetected, striking their targets, and vanishing back into the endless sand before the enemy even registered their presence. He committed this intricate concept to a memorandum. His proposal outlined a unit of approximately 200 men organized into small detachments, meticulously trained in demolitions, desert navigation, and survival techniques. Their mission: to strike airfields, supply dumps, and communication lines located deep within enemy territory. He reasoned that targets so far removed from the front lines would be virtually unguarded, making them highly vulnerable. The cumulative impact of repeated, small-scale attacks, he argued, would inflict crippling damage on enemy morale and logistics. The immediate challenge, however, was getting anyone to actually read his proposal. As a junior lieutenant, barely recovered from injury and burdened by a reputation for indiscipline, he faced formidable obstacles. Senior officers at Middle East headquarters were preoccupied with more urgent matters than entertaining unconventional theories from subordinates, especially those prone to injuring themselves during parachute training. The popular account of what happened next has taken on legendary status. It suggests that the injured lieutenant, still reliant on crutches, bluffed his way past sentries at Middle East headquarters in Cairo, even slipping through a gap in the perimeter fence when denied official entry. Moving with all the speed his injured back would allow, he navigated the headquarters building and, quite by accident, found himself in the office of a senior staff officer, Major General Neil Ritchie, the Deputy Chief of Staff. Before he could be ejected, he presented his memorandum. However, a more recent biography, penned by historian Gavin Mortimer in 2022, offers an alternative perspective. Mortimer contends that it was, in fact, the lieutenant's elder brother, already holding a staff position at headquarters, who ensured the unconventional proposal reached the appropriate desks. The truth may well contain elements of both stories. What matters, ultimately, is that General Ritchie did read the memorandum, found its logic compelling, and advocated for the idea to General Sir Claude Auchinleck, the recently appointed Commander-in-Chief of Middle East Forces. Auchinleck, under intense pressure from Prime Minister Winston Churchill to launch an offensive against Rommel, desperately needed results. He was consequently open to unconventional strategies that might deliver them. 3 days after receiving the audacious memorandum, Auchinleck met the young lieutenant personally. Impressed, he immediately promoted him to captain and authorized the recruitment of 6 officers and 60 men. The new unit was officially designated L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. This name, a deliberate piece of strategic deception, offers insight into the chaotic nature of the war that allowed the SAS to form at all. Brigadier Dudley Clark was, at the time, orchestrating an intricate deception campaign from Cairo. One of his schemes involved the fabrication of a Phantom K detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, complete with fake unit insignia, manipulated photographs, and carefully leaked false intelligence. The objective was to convince the Axis powers that a fully equipped 5,000-man British parachute brigade was operational in North Africa, poised to drop behind Rommel's lines at any moment. This fictitious unit proved so convincing that it had already prompted German forces to divert troops and aircraft to counter a threat that simply did not exist. The real unit became L Detachment, artfully implying the existence of 11 other detachments, A through K. The fictional K detachment remained the grand decoy, making the true, tiny force appear to be merely a small component of a much larger, formidable formation. It was a layer of deception laid upon another. It purchased precious, vulnerable operating space for the nascent SAS. However, Auchinleck's endorsement did not translate into immediate acceptance among the middle and lower echelons of Middle East headquarters. Staff officers remained openly antagonistic. Bureaucrats actively obstructed recruitment efforts, particularly the transfer of officers from the recently disbanded commando force. They withheld adequate equipment, supplies, and transport. Every request was met with delays, outright denial, or simply ignored. The unit's first official act of outfitting itself thus became an act of theft. The officers and men raided a nearby New Zealand regiment's camp, pilfering tents, bedding, and even a piano to furnish their new headquarters at Cabrit, a desolate outpost situated on the Great Bitter Lake. Staff officers at headquarters, it was observed, seemed to actively wish for the SAS to fail, hoping its inevitable collapse would validate their opposition and prevent future unconventional units from disrupting the established military hierarchy. The unit's founder would, later, with characteristic bluntness, describe these officers as fossilized. The men who gravitated to this struggling, defiant unit were a remarkable assortment of nonconformists, adventurers, and natural fighters. They hailed from disbanded commando units, from the long-range desert group, and from regular infantry battalions where their independent spirits had made them unwelcome. What united them was an eagerness to volunteer for missions that promised extreme danger with uncertain prospects of reward. The arduous training program awaiting them at Cabrit was not, by the founder's own admission, designed by him, but by another individual, whom he credited as the true architect of the SS. This man, known universally by his nickname, was born in Calcutta, India, in December 1913. His father was a chartered accountant. Raised in Australia and educated at Christ Church, Oxford, he was a scholar and an athlete, serving as president of the University Boat Club and rowing for the Oxford Eight. He was an intellectual, a natural leader, who had joined the Welsh Guards before transferring to commandos. While the founder provided the political acumen and crucial social connections necessary to sustain the unit against the relentless bureaucratic obstruction, this other man built everything else. He meticulously designed the training regimen, a brutal sequence of desert survival, mastery of weapons, demolition techniques, and celestial navigation. This program would transform civilian soldiers into effective, silent operators capable of functioning for weeks behind enemy lines. He established the core principle that every man in the unit must be cross-trained in every essential skill, ensuring that a team could remain effective even after suffering casualties. He instilled the exacting discipline and meticulous attention to detail that would be the difference between life and death in the harsh desert environment. Crucially, this individual conceived and developed the specialized weapon that underpinned the unit's effectiveness. Existing demolition charges were ill-suited for the precise destruction of aircraft. Standard explosives would blast holes in fuselages, but frequently left aircraft reparable. Incendiary devices could start fires, but often failed to ensure complete destruction. The unit required a device that would simultaneously detonate and ignite, guaranteeing the utter destruction of every aircraft attacked. After weeks of intense experimentation, he refined his solution. This new device consisted of approximately 1 pound of plastic explosive, a type designated Nobel 808, mixed with about a quarter pound of thermite, all bound together with diesel oil. Additional components included steel filings and a 2-ounce dry gun cotton booster, activated by a 30-second time delay fuse. The complete device weighed roughly a pound, making it small enough for a single operative to carry a dozen or more. Upon detonation, the explosive force would rupture fuel tanks, while the thermite would simultaneously ignite the aviation fuel, ensuring total destruction. It was elegant, portable, and devastatingly effective. Every aircraft destroyed by the unit during its initial footborne raids fell victim to this ingenious invention. The third key figure in what would become the unit's wartime leadership was strikingly different from both the aristocratic founder and the intellectual designer. Blair Main, born in January 1915 in Newtownards, County Down, then part of Ireland, hailed from a prosperous family and had become a qualified solicitor. However, his deepest inclination was toward violence, both the controlled aggression of sport and the raw intensity of combat. Main had been the Irish University heavyweight boxing champion. He earned 6 international rugby caps for Ireland, playing as a lock forward, and in 1938 toured South Africa with the British and Irish Lions, earning 3 test caps. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 217 pounds, almost entirely muscle. His fellow soldiers knew him by his nickname, approaching him with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Main possessed a volatile temper, and its eruption was always memorable. He was reportedly recruited into the unit directly from a prison cell, where he awaited court-martial for assaulting his commanding officer. The exact details of the incident varied, depending on who recounted the story, but the crucial point was that Main's military career was on the verge of ending when the unit's founder appeared with an offer of redemption. Main would become the unit's most formidable combatant. But in those early days at Cabret, he was simply another recruit, learning to plant the new bombs and navigate by the stars. The unit's inaugural combat operation was launched on the night of November 16th to 17th, 1941, designed to support Operation Crusader, the major British offensive aimed at relieving the besieged garrison at Tobruk. The plan, codenamed Operation Squatter, called for 55 men, divided into 5 teams, to parachute from Bristol Bombay aircraft onto drop zones near 5 separate Axis airfields at Gazala and Tamimi. Their mission was to plant the new bombs on parked aircraft, then march 50 miles south through the desert to a rendezvous with the long-range desert group, who would transport them back to friendly lines. The weather forecast was dire. Meteorologists predicted gale force winds reaching 30 knots, double the safe limit for parachute operations. The unit's founder faced an impossible dilemma. To cancel the operation would provide Middle East headquarters with the justification to disband his unit before it had achieved anything, vindicating his detractors. To proceed meant risking his men being scattered across the vast desert, unable to reach their targets or their extraction point. He chose to proceed. The 5 stick leaders, the founder himself, Main, the bomb's designer, and Lieutenants A.O. McGonigal and Charles Bonington, boarded their aircraft that evening, flying out over the desert toward the enemy airfields. What ensued was a catastrophe. The winds escalated to force 7 to 8, whipping up a massive sandstorm that reduced visibility to near zero. Pilots flew blind, unable to discern the ground or their designated drop zones. One aircraft, carrying Lieutenant Bonington and his men, was shot down by a German Messerschmitt night fighter. The remaining aircraft discharged their parachutists as best they could, but the howling gale dispersed men and equipment across many miles of desert. Equipment containers, holding the precious new bombs, were torn from their parachutes and lost. Explosives that were recovered had been soaked by the rain that preceded the sandstorm. Men landed miles from their intended drop zones, their navigation equipment damaged or missing. Small groups that managed to reassemble found themselves hopelessly lost, their targets unattainable before the first light of dawn would expose them to enemy aircraft. Not a single shot was fired at the enemy that night. Not a single bomb detonated on an Axis aircraft. Of the 55 men who had jumped, only 21 or 22 straggled back to the long-range desert group rendezvous point over the ensuing days. Lieutenant McGonigal succumbed to injuries sustained during his landing. The remainder were either dead, captured, or simply lost to the unforgiving desert. Operation Squatter was a complete and utter failure. Any rational assessment would have concluded that the SAS experiment was finished. The founders' theories had been rigorously tested against reality, and reality had decisively triumphed. The logical course would have been to reassign the surviving men to their original units and simply erase L detachment from military records. The staff officers at Middle East headquarters certainly anticipated this outcome and were already preparing the paperwork for the unit's dissolution. Yet, during the long, slow journey back from the disaster in the long-range desert group's Chevrolet trucks, the founder was not dwelling on failure. His mind was fixed on the trucks themselves. If the long-range desert group could extract his men from the desert's depths, he reasoned, why couldn't they insert them? The parachute drop had been undone by uncontrollable weather. Vehicle insertion would entirely eliminate that variable. He approached Captain David Lloyd Owen, commander of the long-range desert group patrol that had rescued his men, with a radical new proposition. The long-range desert group had been operating deep within enemy-held territory since 1940, conducting reconnaissance and occasionally attacking targets of opportunity. They possessed an unparalleled knowledge of the desert. What if they transported his raiding parties to within striking distance of enemy airfields, dropped them off, and then returned to pick them up after the attack? Lloyd Owen agreed to present the idea to his commanding officer, and the long-range desert group's leadership, facing their own pressures, agreed to a trial. Barely a month after the unmitigated disaster of Operation Squatter, on December 14, 1941, the unit launched its first successful operations. 3 raiding parties were ferried by long-range desert group vehicles to points near enemy airfields, then proceeded on foot to their objectives. The results surpassed everyone's expectations, save perhaps for the founders. Maine spearheaded his team's assault on Tammet Airfield, approaching under cover of darkness until they reached the perimeter. What transpired next vividly demonstrated why Maine would become the most feared commando of the North African campaign. Discovering the officer's mess still illuminated and occupied, Maine burst through the door, taking approximately 30 Axis airmen by surprise at dinner. He opened fire with his pistol, then withdrew to systematically move through the rows of parked aircraft, planting the designer's bombs on each. The unit claimed 24 aircraft destroyed at Tammet that night, with 0 British casualties. When Maine, with targets still remaining, exhausted his supply of explosives, he reportedly climbed into the cockpit of an untouched aircraft and, using only his bare hands, tore out the instrument panel, ensuring it could never fly again. On December 21st to 22nd, Lieutenant Bill Fraser's 5-man team struck Aguadabia Airfield, deeper into Axis territory. The unit claimed up to 37 aircraft destroyed, though German records reviewed after the war indicated the actual number was closer to 25. This discrepancy between the unit's claims and Axis documentation would become a recurring pattern. Yet even the lower figure represented a remarkable achievement for 5 men operating without direct support. Across multiple raids that December, The unit claimed approximately 60 enemy aircraft destroyed, with not a single man lost in action. The audacious concept that staff officers had dismissed as impossible was now demonstrably proven. General Auchinleck, witnessing these results, promoted the unit's founder to major and authorized the expansion of his force. But this success carried an immediate and heavy cost. On December 31st, 1941, the bomb's designer was returning from a raid on Afilia Airfield in a long-range Desert Group truck when a convoy was spotted by a German aircraft. A Messerschmitt 110 executed repeated, strafing runs on the exposed vehicles. A 20mm cannon round struck the designer in the leg, severing his femoral artery. He bled to death in 4 minutes, surrounded by comrades who possessed no means to staunch the hemorrhage. He was 28 years old. His death was a devastating blow. He had been the intellectual architect of everything that made the unit function, and his loss was profoundly felt by every man he had trained. Yet, the innovative system he had constructed continued to operate. His training methods, his tactical doctrines, and his ingenious bombs endured, passed down to the men who would carry forward the mission he had so brilliantly designed. In the months that followed, the unit conducted raid after raid against enemy airfields and installations. They became utterly reliant on the long-range Desert Group for transportation. This dependency proved to be both a critical advantage and a significant limitation. The long-range Desert Group's Chevrolet 30 weight trucks, affectionately dubbed the Libyan Desert Taxi Service by the men they carried, were reliable and capable of covering immense distances. However, the long-range Desert Group had its own pressing operational priorities, particularly the road watch, a continuous surveillance of the Via Balbia coastal highway to track Axis troop and supply movements. Scheduling conflicts between the two units became increasingly problematic. Their differing mission profiles meant that long-range Desert Group commanders sometimes declined to transport the unit's raiders to targets they deemed too hazardous or too far from their own designated areas of operation. Moreover, this simple loss of operational independence grated on the unit's founder, who believed his force should control its own destiny. The ultimate solution to this logistical problem gradually emerged. Before fully acquiring the iconic Jeeps, the founder salvaged a wrecked Ford station wagon from a Cairo depot. The vehicle, written off after an accident, was stripped of its damaged roof by his men, who then mounted Vickers K-machine guns on improvised stands and painted it in desert camouflage. They christened it the Blitz Buggy. Though unreliable and prone to mechanical breakdowns, it offered the unit its first taste of self-sufficient mobility. The true transformation, however, arrived in June 1942 when the unit obtained its initial allocation of American Willys Jeeps. These vehicles had begun arriving in North Africa in growing numbers as part of Lend-Lease shipments, quickly proving their exceptional capability in the brutal desert conditions. By July, at Maine's persistent urging, the founder returned to Cairo to secure a larger consignment. Through a combination of official requisitions and the unofficial acquisition methods in which the unit had become remarkably proficient, the force soon possessed approximately 16 Jeeps and 20 Bedford 3-ton supply trucks, making them entirely independent of long-range Desert Group transport. But the standard Willys Jeep was never designed as a weapon of war. It was a utilitarian vehicle, intended to convey personnel and light cargo. Transforming it into a formidable desert raiding platform demanded modifications that would have astonished the engineers in Toledo who had originally designed it. The unit drew heavily on techniques pioneered by Major Ralph Bagnold, the founder of the Long-Range Desert Group and one of the world's foremost experts on desert exploration. Bagnold had spent years before the war traversing the Sahara, deciphering its secrets and developing the specialized equipment needed to survive and operate in its unforgiving environment. The initial step was radical weight reduction. Canvas roofs, windscreens, doors, and any non-essential sheet metal were systematically stripped from each Jeep. Every pound removed meant less weight to haul across the sand, thus extending range and significantly improving performance in soft terrain. Bagnold water condensers were fitted to the cooling system. These ingenious devices captured steam escaping from the radiator, condensed it in an external can, and returned the water to the system via vacuum pressure. In the furnace-like heat of the desert, a standard vehicle could lose gallons of coolant to evaporation. The Bagnalled condenser eliminated this critical problem, enabling vehicles to operate for hundreds of miles without requiring radiator top-ups. Steel sand channels, another Bagnalled innovation, were lashed to the sides of each Jeep. When a vehicle inevitably became bogged down in soft sand, these perforated metal tracks could be placed under the wheels to provide traction for self-extraction. Navigation in the featureless desert, where landmarks were non-existent and magnetic compasses unreliable near vehicle metal, required specialized equipment. Bagnalled sun compasses, consisting of a graduated shadow disc and a vertical needle, provided accurate directional readings irrespective of magnetic interference. The navigator would orient the disc according to the time of day and the sun's position, then maintain course by keeping the needle's shadow on the correct bearing. At night, navigation transitioned to the stars, employing techniques that the bomb's late designer had integrated into the unit's training. The most crucial modification addressed the Jeep's inherent limitation, its restricted range. The standard fuel tank held 15 gallons, providing less than 120 miles of travel in the energy-sapping desert sand, where fuel consumption soared dramatically. This capacity was completely inadequate for the deep penetration raids that might require traversing 400 miles or more behind enemy lines. Jerrycan racks were welded to the rear mudguards and bonnets, creating additional capacity for 8 to 12 5-gallon fuel cans. This expanded total fuel capacity to over 60 gallons, extending the operational range beyond 400 miles. Similar racks were fitted to carry water cans and essential spare parts. By the time all modifications were complete, each Jeep resembled a mechanical pack mule more than a conventional military vehicle. But it was the armament that truly transformed the SAS Jeep into a deadly weapon. The primary weapon was the Vickers K machine gun, also known as the Vickers gas-operated gun. This weapon had originally been designed as an observer's gun for Royal Air Force bombers, intended to be fired by rear gunners against attacking enemy fighters. When belt-fed Browning machine guns eventually superseded the Vickers K in aircraft service, large quantities became available as surplus. The Vickers K's characteristics made it nearly ideal for the unit's hit-and-run ground warfare. Chambered in .303 caliber, identical to the standard British rifle, it could fire at an adjustable rate of between 950 and 1,200 rounds per minute, significantly faster than the standard German infantry machine gun. It was fed by 100-round flat-pan magazines that could be changed with speed. The complete weapon weighed a mere 29.5 pounds, light enough for a single operator to manage. Most importantly for desert operations, the Vickers K's low-friction locking mechanism proved remarkably resistant to the fine sand that notoriously jammed and disabled other automatic weapons. A Vickers K could reliably fire even when coated with the pervasive dust that infiltrated every crevice of the desert environment. The typical unit Jeep configuration mounted twin Vickers K guns forward on the passenger side and another pair of Vickers K guns on a swivel mount at the rear. This arrangement gave a single vehicle 4 rapid-fire weapons, capable of generating a devastating volume of fire. Some Jeeps were also equipped with a .50 caliber Browning heavy machine gun at the rear, providing additional hitting power against lightly armored targets or defensive positions. When loaded with a mixture of tracer, incendiary, and armor-piercing ammunition, these weapon systems could tear apart parked aircraft in mere seconds. Tracer rounds allowed gunners to correct their aim in the darkness. Incendiary rounds ignited aviation fuel upon contact. The combination was spectacularly destructive. The first full test of these vehicle-mounted tactics occurred during the Bagish airfield raid on the night of July 7th to 8th, 1942. Maine's team, following established practice, infiltrated the airfield on foot and began planting the designer's bombs on parked aircraft. They placed charges on approximately 40 planes before encountering a critical problem. About half of the bomb primers were damp, likely due to condensation during the desert night, and failed to detonate. Only 22 aircraft were destroyed by the bombs. Frustrated by this partial success, the unit's founder improvised what would rapidly become the unit's signature tactic. He led the Blitz buggy and two of the newly acquired Jeeps directly onto the airfield, driving systematically between the rows of parked aircraft with all guns blazing. Tracer and incendiary round from the Vickers K guns ripped through wings, fuselages, and fuel tanks. Aircraft that had survived the bomb failures were systematically annihilated by gunfire. The unit claimed 15 additional aircraft destroyed by this direct, vehicle-mounted attack, bringing the total at Bagish to roughly 37. It was the first vehicle-mounted airfield assault in history, demonstrating unequivocally that the armed Jeep could be even more effective than raiders on foot. Bombs demanded time to place and relied on finicky fuses. Guns delivered their destruction instantly and reliably. This tactic reached its apex of perfection 3 weeks later in what became the most renowned unit raid of the Desert War. On the night of July 26th to 27th, 1942, 18 armed Jeeps, carrying approximately 60 British and Free French commandos, assembled for an attack on Sidi Hainish Airfield. The force was personally led by the unit's founder, with Maine commanding one of the Jeep columns. They departed their hideout at Bir el Qusir in the late afternoon, traversing 50 miles of open desert, navigating first by sun compass and then by stars as darkness enveloped them. Their navigator, Mike Sadler, a seasoned long-range desert group veteran who had transferred to the unit, would later be recognized as the finest desert navigator of the entire war. As the column neared the airfield perimeter, around 10 o'clock in the evening, an unexpected event occurred. The runway lights suddenly flickered on, starkly illuminating rows of parked aircraft. For a brief moment, the raiders feared they had been detected. Then they grasped the truth. A Luftwaffe bomber was coming into land, and the ground crew had illuminated the field for its approach. The unit had arrived at precisely the most opportune moment. At approximately 15 minutes past 10, the founder fired a green Very flare, the signal to attack. The 18 Jeeps surged onto the airfield in AV formation, 9 vehicles in each column, with gunners on both sides firing outwards at the parked aircraft. The noise was deafening. Tracer rounds carved brilliant lines through the darkness. Aircraft exploded as incendiary bullets found their fuel tanks. German and Italian ground crews scattered in all directions, some scrambling toward defensive positions, but most simply fleeing the overwhelming chaos. The assault lasted approximately 15 minutes. The unit claimed 37 to 40 Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed, including Junkers 87 Stuka dive bombers, Junkers 52 transport aircraft, and Messerschmitt 109 fighters. However, German records scrutinized after the war indicated the actual number was closer to 20 aircraft destroyed or severely damaged. Even this lower figure represented an astonishing accomplishment. The unit suffered 1 man killed during the actual assault. Lance Bombardier John Robson, 21 years old, was shot through the head while manning his machine gun. He was the sole Allied casualty of the assault itself. The subsequent withdrawal, however, did not unfold as smoothly. As dawn approached, the French element of the unit, which had been assigned a secondary target, found itself behind schedule. Tire punctures on the rugged desert surface had impeded their progress, leaving them exposed at first light to 4 German Stuka dive bombers. The aircraft made repeated strafing runs on the vulnerable Jeeps. 2 vehicles were destroyed. An aspiring philosopher and French paratrooper, André Zernheld, who had written poetry about war and faith, was hit in the shoulder and abdomen. He died approximately 13 hours later, surrounded by his comrades. A notebook recovered after his death contained a prayer that began with the words, "I bring before thee, Lord, the souls of the soldiers who are about to die." It would eventually become the official prayer of the French airborne forces. The combined effect of multiple simultaneous and near-simultaneous raids significantly compounded the damage inflicted that July. On the same night as the Bagish raid, other French teams attacked Fuka airfield, while Maine struck El Daba. A second raid on Fuca later in July destroyed additional enemy bombers. July 1942 alone likely saw 75 to 85 Axis aircraft claimed destroyed by these Jeep raids, though confirmed kills were lower. By this point in the campaign, the unit's founder could report to Middle East headquarters that his force had claimed the destruction of at least 143 Axis aircraft in just 6 months of operations. Even allowing for the natural tendency of raiding forces to exaggerate their kills, the strategic impact was undeniable. The unit that headquarters had attempted to strangle at its inception was now producing results that could not be ignored. The cumulative effect of these raids provoked an increasingly desperate Axis response. Field Marshal Rommel himself reportedly remarked that the unit's founder and his men inflicted more harm and damage than any other unit of comparable size within Allied forces. The founder earned the moniker the Phantom Major, though whether this nickname originated from German intelligence or the British press remains debated. The Germans implemented escalating countermeasures. Airfield security was drastically increased. Guard posts were established around aircraft dispersal areas. Patrols were mounted around the clock. The fundamental problem, however, was that these security measures demanded troops, and troops assigned to guard rear area airfields were troops unavailable for the front lines. This was precisely the force-multiplying effect the founder had predicted in his original memorandum. A mere few dozen of his raiders were effectively tying down hundreds of Axis soldiers. Maine, after one raid, noted grimly that the enemy had stationed a sentry on nearly every aircraft. Yet, even this measure proved insufficient. Maine, in his characteristic style, simply neutralized the sentries before planting his bombs. Axis intelligence also attempted more sophisticated countermeasures. They deployed a spy, the Anglo-Swiss fascist Theodore Church, who posed as a captured British officer in prisoner-of-war camps to extract information from captured unit members. A former French Foreign Legionnaire, Herbert Bruckner, who had joined the unit under false pretenses, betrayed upcoming raid plans to the Germans. Operations against airfields at Derna and Markthuba subsequently failed as a result, the targets having been evacuated before the raiders even arrived. The most significant response, however, emanated from the highest echelons of the Nazi regime. On October 18, 1942, Adolf Hitler personally issued the infamous Commando Order, known in German as the Kommandobefehl, distributed in only 12 copies and classified as top secret. The order dictated that all commandos operating against German forces were to be annihilated to the last man, regardless of whether they wore proper military uniforms or attempted to surrender. The Commando Order was significantly influenced by the unit's operations, alongside other commando raids like the Dieppe Assault and Operation Basalt in the Channel Islands. It constituted a grave war crime, a blatant violation of the laws of armed conflict that had protected prisoners of war since the 19th century. At the Nuremberg trials after the war, General Alfred Jodl was, in part, found guilty for his role in disseminating and implementing this order. In June 1942 alone, the unit claimed to have destroyed an estimated 8% of all German aircraft in North Africa, a staggering proportion for a force of fewer than 200 men. Even if this figure was exaggerated, and even if the actual percentage was half that, the strategic impact was immense. Accurately estimating the total number of aircraft destroyed by the unit during the North African campaign necessitates navigating considerable discrepancies between various sources. The most stringent academic figure, derived from Alan Vick's Rand Corporation study titled Snakes in the Eagle's Nest, documented 367 aircraft destroyed by all British Special Forces combined in the theater. This aggregate figure includes not only the unit in question, but also the Special Boat Service, the Long Range Desert Group, and agents of the Special Operations Executive. Other historians have put forward higher estimates. Author Damian Lewis, citing operational records and an interview with the Imperial War Museums, suggested 387 proven and approximately 450 probable destructions attributed specifically to this unit. Conservative estimates typically begin around 250, while the highest claims exceed 400. The unit's overcounting was common and entirely understandable. At Aguadabia, the unit claimed 37 aircraft destroyed, while Axis records indicated approximately 25. At Sidi Hainish, the unit claimed 37 to 40, while German documentation showed closer to 20. Men attacking an airfield at night, amidst explosions, gunfire, and raging fires, naturally overestimated the damage they inflicted. Aircraft already unserviceable might not have been recorded as losses in Axis documentation, even if physically destroyed. Both sides, it must be noted, had motivations to manipulate the numbers. What remains indisputable is that a unit never exceeding a few hundred men inflicted damage equivalent to a conventional air wing, at negligible cost in terms of its own personnel and material. The assertion that this unit destroyed more enemy aircraft than the Royal Air Force managed in air combat during the same period is broadly accepted by institutions like the Imperial War Museums and numerous historians, though it may hold most precisely for specific months of 1942 rather than the entire campaign duration. Amidst these extraordinary figures and high-profile exploits, individuals like Reg Seekings represented another vital aspect of the unit, the working-class bedrock that complemented the aristocratic officers and celebrated warriors. Born in March 1920 near Ely in Cambridgeshire, the son of a farm laborer, Seekings had enlisted in the army despite being almost completely blind in one eye. Regulations should have unequivocally barred him from service, but he had meticulously memorized the eye chart and successfully deceived the medical examiners. An original member of L Detachment, Seekings not only survived the disaster of Operation Squatter, but went on to participate in 10 major raids during the North African campaign. He personally claimed the destruction of more than 15 aircraft and, through sheer merit and survival, ascended from private to squadron sergeant major. He earned both the Distinguished Conduct Medal and the Military Medal, decorations typically awarded for extraordinary valor. Historians would later characterize him as the great unsung hero of the wartime unit, the quiet power behind the more flamboyant founders. The war for the unit's founder concluded personally on January 24, 1943, in southern Tunisia. The commander was leading a raiding party deep into enemy territory, attempting to be the first 8th Army unit to link up with 1st Army forces advancing from the west. Even Brigadier George Davey had cautioned him, warning that he was pushing too close to the enemy, taking too many risks with too little intelligence. The warning proved prescient. The Founders Party was detected by German patrols and forced to scatter. He himself managed to evade the initial contact and found temporary refuge among local Arab tribesmen. However, according to unit tradition, these Arabs subsequently betrayed his location to the Germans in exchange for goods or money. He managed one escape from German custody, but was recaptured by Italian forces and flown to Rome for interrogation. The founder proved as resistant to captivity as he had been to authority. He orchestrated at least 4 escape attempts from various prisoner-of-war camps, on one occasion coming within miles of the Swiss border before being recaptured. Ultimately, the Germans transferred him to Colditz Castle, the notorious fortress in Saxony classified as escape-proof, where the most persistent Allied escapers were concentrated. He spent the remainder of the war there, serving as chief of the escape committee, meticulously planning breakouts that other men would execute. His capture initially triggered fears that the unit would be disbanded. The force had been so intimately identified with its founder that many assumed it could not survive without him. Instead, Maine assumed command on January 27, 1943, and led the unit through the remainder of the North African campaign. Under Maine's leadership, the unit participated in the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943, spearheading the assault at Capo Muro di Porco. The founder's brother, Bill, raised a 2nd Regiment in Algeria in May 1943, effectively doubling the unit's strength. By September 1942, even before the founder's capture, General Anlec had already granted the unit full regimental status, the ultimate vindication of a concept that military bureaucrats had fiercely tried to extinguish at its birth. Maine himself survived the war, though not for long. He was tragically killed in a car accident in Northern Ireland in 1955, driving home late at night. His wartime decorations included the Distinguished Service Order with 3 bars, placing him among the most decorated British soldiers of the conflict. Even King George VI had reportedly inquired why the Victoria Cross had so unusually eluded him. The unspoken answer likely resided in Maine's notoriously difficult personality and his long history of friction with superior officers. Valor alone, it seemed, was never quite sufficient for Britain's highest military honor. Field Marshal Montgomery is said to have remarked that the boy Sterling is quite mad. Quite mad. However, in a war there is often a place for mad people. Whether Montgomery actually uttered these exact words has never been definitively confirmed, but the sentiment accurately captures a prevailing view within the military establishment regarding the unit and its unconventional founder. Decades later, the commander of the United States Delta Force, an American special operations unit that directly traces its lineage to the unit's methods and traditions, wrote to the founder with far greater reverence. The common bond between the special forces of the Western world is that we all trace our roots back to you. The unit's North African campaign remains one of military history's most striking early examples of asymmetric warfare, a term yet to be coined. A force conceived by a junior lieutenant whom the establishment viewed as an undisciplined gambler, actively opposed by the very headquarters meant to support it, and nearly obliterated in its very first operation, went on to inflict strategic-level damage, with resources typically reserved for tactical engagements. The central irony is inescapable. The vehicle that enabled British Special Forces to become so lethal in the desert was not British at all. The Willis Jeep was conceived in America, manufactured in Toledo, Ohio, and shipped across the Atlantic as part of Lend-Lease. It was designed as a simple utility vehicle, intended to move personnel and light cargo around military installations. No one at Willis Overland or within the United States Army had ever envisioned it bristling with machine guns and charging across enemy airfields under the cover of night. The unique marriage of this humble American vehicle with surplus British aircraft machine guns created a weapons system that no military planner had ever conceptualized. British ingenuity, American manufacturing, and the vast, empty expanses of the North African desert converged to produce something unprecedented. The armed Jeep evolved beyond a mere raiding platform. It became a symbol of unconventional thinking, a testament to the willingness to improvise, adapt, and overcome the relentless pressures that defined the unit from its very beginning. What began as 66 men and a stolen piano in a desolate camp on the Great Bitter Lake became the foundational blueprint for every special operations unit that followed. The descendants of L Detachment now serve in the special forces of every Western nation and many others besides. They operate with different weapons and drive different vehicles, but their core principles remain those forged by David Sterling, Jock Lewis, and Paddy Mayne in the Egyptian desert more than 80 years ago. The Willis Jeep itself has long since faded into history, superseded by purpose-built special operations vehicles equipped with armor, night vision, and satellite navigation. Yet, every single one of those modern vehicles owes a debt to the sand-colored raiders that burst on a seedy Hainish airfield on that July night in 1942, guns blazing.